Today's video is going to be a bit different. We are going to talk straight up politics. We're discussing the polls, Trump, Poilievre, and of course, how that all relates to the gun control conversation. Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be talking about the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre. Now, I don't normally talk about politics directly, and for good reason. In most of my videos and in the description, I make a point of telling everyone that I'm not a lawyer and that my perspectives should therefore not be taken as legal advice. But I'm even less of a political or polling analyst. In my videos, I typically make every effort to be as informed as possible about the law so as to pass on information as accurately as I can. However, the topic of politics is not exactly my forte, so this video really should be taken as little more than just an opinion. And it's my opinion that Pierre Poilievre has got to start stepping up his game here. Until now, he's had a pretty easy time with a lot of his messaging and campaigning. Like, as much as anything, his success in the polls until now was largely due to Canadians' wide-scale disdain for Trudeau, as much as it was support for Poilievre specifically. And for what it's worth, I'm not actually one of those people. I've been a big fan of Poilievre for quite a long time now, and even before he started running for leadership for the Conservatives. So when he became the leader, I was thrilled. However, now that Trudeau is essentially out of the picture for the future of Canada, the polls have begun shifting in a pretty significant manner. Now, it's worth noting that a lot of these polls are from fairly questionable sources, so the actual values are likely blown out of proportion. And if you take a look at polling agencies like ECOS, I mean, they're just straight up not to be trusted. And I'm not saying that because I'm some kind of conservative shill or anything. I'm saying that because ECOS is essentially delusional and they're manipulating the polls. Like, for example, if you check out regional polling around October or November of last year in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, it becomes rather obvious. Every other polling agency out there had the Conservatives at around like a good solid 30-point lead in the polls over the Liberals. Yet ECOS is out here saying that the Liberals had a chance, or even that they're actually out in front, giving the Liberals a 9-point lead against all of these other polls makes ECOS look borderline mentally ill. And that poll isn't exactly some isolated anomaly either, since most of the other polls during this time show the Liberals polling close to the Conservatives, despite everyone else showing a clear and dominant lead for the Conservatives. Also, if you take a look at the history of ECOS, they normally only poll once a month or so. But if you take a look at what has happened since Trudeau's resignation, ECOS put out 4 separate polls in about 3 weeks, and now another just a couple days ago. That gives them 5 polls in about a 1-month span, as opposed to their usual 1 or sometimes 2. Like, this is clear evidence that they're attempting to put their finger on the scales in order to disproportionately affect the apparent national average of polls. Now, other polling agencies, such as Nanos, they typically put out polls every week or so, and they continue to do so that wouldn't be unusual for them, but it's extremely unusual for an agency like ECOS. As far as whether or not we should be worried about the current state of the polls, which appear to show the Conservatives slipping away and the Liberals gaining some serious ground, we should be skeptical of that as well. A lot of people are out there in panic mode about the Conservatives' recent downward trajectory, especially on 338canada.com, but we need to take those numbers with a grain of salt. As I just demonstrated with ECOS, those numbers can be manipulated, and the manipulation isn't necessarily always intentional, which is unfortunate. I typically refer to 338 for the same reason that a lot of people actually use it. Quite frankly, I don't know that much about polls. I don't usually spend a lot of time analyzing them. So I don't know much more about these polling agencies other than, frankly, their names. So having a website where I could go to have these polls simplified, averaged, and then weighted based on their reliability was a pretty useful tool for me. But if 338 is unable to filter out information when a particular agency spams unreliable results in order to shift the average, then that kind of brings 338 into question as well. But if we just take the numbers at face value, things really aren't all that dire quite just yet. The Conservatives really haven't actually dropped that much at all. If you look at where they were for most of last year, the Conservatives polled nationally at somewhere between 40 to 43%. which is basically where they still are right now, with the exception of the Ecos polls. The Conservatives enjoyed a slight bump during the Christmas season for some reason, but all we're really seeing so far is the loss of that bump. Where the Liberals are regaining most of their support is from the deteriorating NDP and Bloc numbers. And this causes a much less split vote for the left-leaning voters of the country and causes the Liberals to begin winning a lot more of their ridings where the Conservatives didn't otherwise have a commanding lead. Which means what we're mostly seeing right now is not necessarily a loss of faith in the Conservatives or Pierre Poilievre, but rather a loss in the faith of the NDP and Jagmeet. So if we want the Conservatives to have their supermajority back, I think we need to start cheering on Jagmeet a little bit more, which is something I never thought I'd hear myself say. But whatever the source, there is no doubt that the Liberals have enjoyed a sizable bump in the polls since Trudeau announced his resignation. However, I don't really expect any of that to last. I know that a lot of my viewers watch the YouTuber The National Telegraph, and he appears to be very good at interpreting the polls, or at the very least, he talks a pretty good game. However, it's also worth noting that he is a fairly conservative individual, and I've not been watching him for long enough to be able to evaluate whether or not this actually clouds his judgment. Now, I'm not trying to throw shade or anything here, because he also has a lot of sound justification for what he says, but it's his opinion that the Liberal bump we're seeing is very likely the temporary result of a response bias, and that isn't being correctly filtered out by a lot of the polls. Basically, he thinks that the Liberals are gaining artificial polling support because of people being less depressed about the idea of having to vote for Trudeau again, but that support likely won't be there come election day. Now, he has a good chunk of evidence to support this beyond his own credibility or expertise, but one of the more impactful things that he makes a point of saying is about just how many Liberal MPs are out there intentionally not seeking re-election. Like, if it were true that the party was poised to pull off the greatest electoral comeback in Canadian history, then why are nearly 36 Liberal MPs not seeking re-election? And he also makes a point of saying that these are mostly younger politicians with nice, long, healthy careers open to them if they wanted them. So if they did actually believe victory was on the horizon, why are they quitting now? And we continue to see more resignations every week. Like, it doesn't really add up if you assume the Liberals are actually doing well on the hearts and minds of Canadians. But something I haven't heard him, or really anyone else say, is that these polls are essentially double dipping. Being that the Liberals are in a leadership race right now, there is a lot of support for the Liberals based on who could become the leader rather than who actually is the leader. The two most likely right now, of course, appear to be Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney, and Mark Carney appears to have a sizable lead, but I'm doubtful that a leadership race would go his way because of how they work. Essentially, leadership votes take place across multiple elimination rounds, and each round the candidate with the lowest votes is eliminated, and their votes get redistributed among the remaining members. And this process then continues until someone receives a majority of the support. So if you look at the numbers here provided by Main Street Research and put up by the National Telegraph a few days ago on Valentine's Day, Carney only has 38% of the vote, whereas Chrystia Freeland is sitting around 29%. But I think that the kind of people who might vote for the other women like Ruby Dalla or Karina Gould would probably also fall into Camp Freeland if and when their preferred candidates are eliminated. So Freeland could very easily win this yet. And the same thing sort of happens nationally as well. Lots of people may poll and say that they'd go Liberal on the idea that they like either Carney or Freeland, but once one or the other gets selected, the Liberals are likely to lose the other half of these new voters. And I think a lot of the surge that we're seeing of people leaving the NDP and going to the Liberals is probably people who are interested in seeing a female prime minister. It's certainly no secret that NDP voters are overrepresented by young women, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of people in the NDP and Liberal lines of thought have completely bought into the idea of identity politics. So having a Liberal leadership race full of mostly female candidates could be of significant interest to voters who are tired of a failing NDP party led by Jagmeet. Now conversely, some of the lost vote from the Conservatives are likely people who are tired of the Liberals' colossal failures, particularly on the economic front. They may have been Liberals in their heart, but ultimately they decided that they absolutely cannot afford to have the Liberals calling the shots anymore. And Carney probably appeals to that sort of voter. He's a guy who at least claims to know what he's talking about financially due to his past jobs and educational background, and most notably his work with both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. But that kind of voter would probably not be interested in a Canada run by Freeland, especially not during a time with all the economic and annexation threats that are being made by Trump. Likewise, the sort of people who want Canada to have its first female prime minister are unlikely to leave the NDP and vote Liberal if Carney is at the helm. And I find it hard to believe that any NDP members would vote for the perceived capitalist-type central banker guy. Carney is essentially the epitome of what they should hate. So the polls do show that the Liberals are doing unusually well, and the leadership race is giving them a significant bump, but I think a lot of that is going to end very abruptly once a leader is finally decided upon. Look, no matter who wins it, the Liberals will lose a notable chunk of support cheering for the other side. And then there's the new Trump problem. The issue of Trump's tariffs and annexation threats is at the forefront of Canadian issues right now all of a sudden. That's also driving a good chunk of the support for the Liberals right now as well. A lot of people don't want an election or a change of government in the middle of this manufactured crisis. And I call it a manufactured crisis because I don't actually believe Trump wants Canada. And I also think he doesn't want tariffs either. I mean, not really. But also probably not for the reason you think. Now, I say he doesn't want tariffs, and a lot of people are saying that. But most people are saying that this is a negotiation tactic so that Canada will fix its borders and develop its military and so on. And they say that if Canada simply complies with the criteria set forth by Trump, then Trump will back off on the tariffs. And I don't know if that's true. He's kind of flip-flopped on this messaging a number of times in the last couple of months here, but Trump has recently said that he plans to institute global reciprocal tariffs, indicating his tariff plans are not just limited to the problems of neighboring Mexico and Canada, but they're going to be applying worldwide. Now, these global reciprocal tariffs are a bit different than what we've been threatened with specifically in Canada, so I'm not really going to get into them, but this indicates that Trump isn't just using the tariffs selectively to encourage Canadian or even NATO behavior. I think the fundamental reason for all these tariffs is pretty simple. It's revenue generation through taxation. Like, it's no secret that the US is in a death spiral of debt right now. Much of his election mandate from the Americans was to fix the incredible government corruption and overspending. And this is specifically what Elon Musk is doing right now with the new Doge agency in the US. And he explains the issue very clearly here.
The government is spending far, far more than it brings in. And the reality is that all government spending is actually taxation. All government spending is taxation. Sometimes people think some of it is taxation and some of it's not. But it's all taxation because the part that is not covered by tax revenue becomes inflation. So you're either taxed directly or you're taxed by inflation, but you're for sure taxed. So it can't be like, we'll trim a little bit here and there. That's not going to work. There have to be quite radical reductions in cost.
The problem in the US right now is that they spend massively more money than they bring in. Even more so than the radical inflation Trudeau has done to Canada. Now, much of the problem is obviously the government corruption and waste, but the other half of the problem is their basic tax revenues are just not high enough for all their spending. However, increasing various incomes or business taxes is just never a popular move, so they needed other sources of income. A tariff, rebranded as a form of nationalism and an American first policy, will act as that alternate revenue source without appearing to be a direct tax on American citizens, even though it sort of is. And it's something he's going to have to do, at least for the short term, regardless of anything else, because long-term tariffs are also no good for the US either. And this is evidenced by the fact that this actually hurts Poilievre and the Conservatives in the election. The things that Trump is demanding for Canada to fix are things that Poilievre has been campaigning on for years. Poilievre has said he wants to fix the border. He wants to stop the flow of the drugs, jail and not bail, and so on. We've all heard that stuff. And he also wants to revamp the Canadian military. Like, he's been saying this stuff for years now. But somehow, the Trump tariffs and annexation threats are helping the Liberals. But of course, Trump isn't an idiot. I mean, he kind of is. He certainly runs his mouth maybe a little bit more than he should in a lot of his interviews. But most of his large-scale deliberate strategies are usually fairly well thought out and equal parts controversial. So if all he truly wanted was to actually have the border fixed and to actually have Canada's military fixed and so on, then the smart play to be made would have been to just keep his mouth shut about Canada. This problem was going to sort itself out in a few months anyway, and Trump would have known this. But he didn't. So if anything, it appears that Trump is attempting to help the Liberals win another election. He belittles Canada and Governor Trudeau in order to provoke ideals of nationalism and unity against his right-wing ideals. And I think that's the intentional outcome of all of this, especially when you consider the annexation threats of Canada becoming the 51st state. Like America, frankly just too broke to afford Canada. And politically speaking, bringing Canada into the fold would be basically like having a Northern California to deal with. Republicans would struggle to win future elections in the US ever again, so it's bad for the Republicans, and the US doesn't have the political or economic capital to pull it off. We would probably end up being more hassle than we're worth, frankly. However, if the Liberals manage to pull off another election victory, I can tell you for sure right now that there would be significant calls in Alberta and probably even Saskatchewan for us to secede from Canada. There is already a not insignificant portion of the population in these areas who are absolutely done with the oppression from Quebec and Ottawa. There is also a broader West versus East separatist debate in Canada which has been going on for much longer than that. If my comment section is of any indication, a lot of people watching this channel would love to become the 51st state simply to have a Second Amendment at this point. Like, one of the obstacles that always gets in the way of any provinces separating from Canada has been that individually, any province is not strong enough on its own, and that Canada really needs all of its provinces in order for it to function. So it may be a stressful relationship, but Alberta needs Canada as much as Canada needs Alberta. There's no functional way to break the relationship. However, that delicate truce of mutually assured failure breaks if individual provinces have somewhere else to go. And this outcome actually makes a lot more sense for Trump, if you ask me. Like, he doesn't want a North California, and he probably doesn't have the economic or political capital to annex Canada, even if he truly wanted to. However, if he can capitalize on an already divided country and give disgruntled provinces like Alberta or Saskatchewan a place to go, that makes a lot of sense to me. And now, he's not dealing with all the problems of having a North California. Instead, he's gaining something like a North Montana. A North Montana that is absolutely stacked with deliberately underutilized natural resources and likely Republican voters. There are significant oil and gas reserves found in Alberta, as well as countless natural resources, minerals, potash, uranium, you name it, from Saskatchewan. And this says nothing of their respective agricultural outputs, which are massive. And it's possible that Trump might be aiming to get all of that at a bargain without needing much political capital or economic capital by setting Canada up to divide itself while leaving America to look like a comforting shoulder to cry on after a bad breakup with the oppressive Canadian Laurentian elite. Now, me personally, I live in Saskatchewan, but I don't want to be an American. I'm a Canadian. But the Canadian that I am no longer aligns with the Canada that I live in. Now, I'm still of the mind that that means that we should fix Canada, but if it can't be fixed, which is looking more and more likely every day, then I really have to toy with the question. Like, America certainly isn't perfect either, and it has no shortage of its own issues, but Canada really has gone off the deep end here in recent years. Left-wing tyranny and extremism is slowly becoming the norm, which is also why we've been looking at a conservative supermajority for most of the last year, and it was looking like the Liberal Party of Canada may be going out of business. Which is the correct response to have to that extremism. At the very least, it indicated to me that people were paying enough attention that Canadian democracy could sort of self-correct when things go too wrong. However, if Poilievre and the Conservatives fail to get a majority, or worse, somehow manage to lose the election, then that's an indication to me that Canada really can't be saved. Even a slight majority of, let's say, 180 seats would still be concerning to me. If the election isn't a completely dominant landslide victory for the Conservatives after a decade of the Liberals rather intentionally destroying the country, that's a problem. Now, I do want to be clear about something here. The problem isn't that the Liberals might potentially win. The problem is that the Liberals could win despite the clear track record of how horrible they've been doing over the last 10 years. Like, this can only mean that Canadians are either not paying any attention, or they are paying attention, but they like the socialism and tyranny that they're seeing. And I'm not sure which explanation is worse. Like, in theory, there's nothing inherently wrong with having a liberal government. It's kind of a tired cliche at this point, but in some sense, I'm even a liberal myself. Freedom is my fundamental value, so liberalism sounds like a pretty good deal to me. But the Liberals don't actually support liberalism anymore. And that's somehow become like a conservative value in Canada. And that's certainly not even a recent development, but Trudeau really put it out on full display and demonstrated it to the entire country, as well as the rest of the world. Like, beyond any doubt. However, despite all that, the Liberals, somehow, still have a shocking amount of support in Canada. So either Canadians aren't paying the attention that they should, or for some reason they like what they're seeing. Which brings us to the actual purpose of this video, and why I say Pierre Poilievre needs to step up his game. Like, as it stands now, I'm still not too worried about the Conservatives losing the next election whenever it happens. But if the Liberals have the opportunity to handcuff the Conservatives with a minority government, they will absolutely jump at the chance. So when I saw Poilievre's rebrand to a Canada First election campaign, I shook my head. Like, I'll be the first to admit I don't know the first thing about running an election campaign. But right now, Trump is public enemy number one. So Poilievre running with essentially the same campaign branding that Trump did feels like it should hurt more than it helps. Conservatism in Canada already struggles with a pretty significant branding issue. Anything associated with the right, with the center right, or even the center left at this point, is seen as intolerant bigotry or racism or whatever other nonsense. And I feel like that's the biggest political issue which encompasses most of the problems we see in Canada. Like, there's just no balance here. Conservative policies are automatically interpreted with negative connotations, even if they're genuinely pretty excellent ideas. As much as we like to blame the mainstream media for this, and they are certainly to blame for a lot of it, it's also the result of poor branding. And appearing to sound like Trump is about as bad as branding gets in Canada right now. For the typical voter who's actually paying attention, branding doesn't actually make any difference. But most people in Canada don't pay enough attention to politics. And most voters don't even pay enough attention to politics. And this is something that I think the National Telegraph probably overestimates in a lot of his videos. He does genuinely make a lot of good points for why he thinks the polls are not representative of what we might see on election day. And they all sound like good points. They really do. But they're all based on the idea that people are paying attention. That people understand who Mark Carney is and what his failings are. But if people were making calculated and informed opinions before they voted, Canada wouldn't be in the mess that it's currently in right now. Like, I could very easily see how a new, younger voter who is not really paying much attention to any of the politics or Canadian politics would go out and vote for the first time, and before voting, he or she could ask, who's this Poilievre guy? What's he about? Canada First? Oh, that's a Trump thing. I don't like Trump. I'm not voting for him. And that's that. Like, people vote on their feelings as much as anything else. Now, to be clear, I'm not actually hating on the message itself. Putting Canada first should be the primary function of any prime minister. I know, controversial opinion here. A country's leader focusing on what's best for their country? Revolutionary concept. So no, I'm not hating on the idea, but it's a message that fails to understand the problem. And that problem is branding. And that's also the very same problem that we face in the firearms community here in Canada. As much as the media and the liberal disinformation campaigns are to blame for this issue, we also create this issue ourselves. Like, right now in Canada, the battle against us is one about military-style firearms or assault-style firearms versus hunting-style firearms. This is a battle of brands. Like, those categories of firearms don't actually exist. They tell you nothing about the firearms or their capabilities. However, it's a brand battle that the Liberals will win because, after all, why does any normal civilian need military capabilities? What are these military capabilities? Doesn't matter. Civilians don't need them because the civilians aren't militaries. Civilians hunt deer. The military doesn't hunt deer. These armaments must be different. Now again, for the knowledgeable people who are paying attention, branding doesn't matter. I know how dumb these terms are, and most of the people watching this channel probably know how meaningless these labels are. But the vast majority of people in Canada do not. And that's because for the uninformed, it's not a dispute over information, it's a dispute over branding. And that's all the conversation ever amounts to. Hunting versus military. Everything that is unnecessary to own and shouldn't be owned. And we see Pierre Poilievre playing into this losing battle. He once again fails on this branding front. Like, how many times have you heard him talk about Grandpa Joe's hunting rifle? How do you think that's actually going to play out during election season? Carney or Freeland will simply say that we need to ban these military-grade assault weapons like the AR-15, which, as we know, is just a cacophony of lies wrapped up in powerful branding, and Poilievre will respond with empty words about how that's Grandpa Joe's hunting rifle. Even though it's true that AR-15s are completely appropriate and competent hunting rifles, the general public won't understand. Like with most issues, The Conservatives can't win the branding battle on this one. He needs to defeat the branding battle with information to make the branding worthless, yet we never actually see him do that. He often says that we're not the problem, we should focus on criminals, jail not bail, and that's a good start to the information conversation, but he never takes it any further than that, and most people will not understand why we can't do both. For example, if you watched my Sydney Island deer call video, where I broke down the story about how the government is essentially hiring foreign sharpshooters at exorbitant prices to use these very same assault-style firearms to take down deer. Firearms that the Liberal government swears up and down that they should not be used to hunt deer. Yet when asked about it, Parks Canada said in an interview with thegunblog.ca that these firearms are not just appropriate for hunting deer, but that they are in fact the global standard for hunting deer. And so are things like suppressors and standard capacity magazines. Like, that's the global standard if you want to take down animals like deer, according to Parks Canada. And people need to understand that it's completely normal to use these kinds of rifles for hunting, not simply to call it Grandpa Joe's hunting rifle and call it a day. And then there are also other angles like C-21's red flag laws. Lots of Canadians think that the Liberals have somehow saved Canada because all they know about gun laws are what they think about America's perceived lack of gun laws and assume that Canada is the same. And again, that's another issue of branding. So Trudeau announced enhanced background checks and new red flag laws, which is nonsense. Not that the measures themselves are nonsense exactly, but Canada has had these measures in place for decades now. So when Poilievre says he's going to repeal C-21, people think that what he's actually saying is he's repealing red flag laws, which is, again, not true, but he doesn't explain it. Like, he needs to explain to people why the new red flag laws aren't actually red flag laws, and that Canada has always had red flag laws, and that these new supposed red flag laws are essentially designed to eliminate the fair protection for lawful gun owners against the weaponization of existing red flag laws. Like, I think that's something that a lot of Canadians could understand and get behind, but we never see Poilievre do that. And you might say that a lot of these answers take too long to dive into, and that's a fair observation, but we don't even see him do it during some of his longer form interviews where he has far more time to dive into these talking points if he wants to do so. And there are far more talking points that he could dissect than just red flag laws or hunting rifles. And honestly, that's kind of even the entire reason I started this channel. Like, when it comes to the gun control conversation, we tend to be very lazy with what we're saying, and we fall victim to a branding war that we just can't hope to win. We need to be much more specific and more informative to the masses. Like, we are on the correct side of this debate, and we shouldn't have to default to lazy rhetoric or branding in order to win it. In fact, by doing so, I think we actually lose it. So much of the focus of this channel was always supposed to be elevating the gun control conversation, and that's also why I find Pierre Poilievre's willingness to fight the debate with bad branding so disheartening. Now, the gun control conversation itself is not important enough for any politician to win an election on Canada, but he could certainly lose one over it. With the polls starting to look as close as they are, we have to consider the possibility that this debate could easily be the difference between a majority and a minority government. Winning or losing a couple percent of the voters either way over what Grandpa Joe's hunting rifle is could end up being the difference in this election if he's not careful. And it would be a real shame to see that happen. Now, to be fair to Poilievre, it might be that he already knows all of this, and he simply doesn't want to show his hand until election season and all of the debates roll around. So it might be good to give him the benefit of the doubt here. But, as it stands right now, Pierre Poilievre's position on firearms is built into a lot of 15 to 30 second sound bites. It's good for TV, it's good for YouTube, but it lacks substance. I don't know the first thing about running an election campaign, so if this is what winning looks like, then so be it. But I think it can't be understated just how important it is to get it right this time around in order to put Canada back on the right path. Because if Canadians are becoming as gullible as they appear to be, we might not get another chance at it.